Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today for JFK and the Space Race. How did the US achieve the goal of landing on the moon by 1969? We're going to go behind the scenes of the Kennedy space program with photographs and stories from the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum collections. We're going to enjoy a slide presentation with live commentary and Q&A from Rick Elias, who's a docent at the Presidential Library. So all, let's see, 50 of us or so. Let's give a big virtual round of applause to Rick for joining us here this afternoon. And Rick, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much. And welcome, everybody. I appreciate Robert asking me to join you. I wish I could tell you that I was broadcasting, doing this from the library. However, the library is not completely open yet because of the pandemic. But for those of you who are interested, the library is now open from Thursdays through Sundays from 10 to 4. They are limiting attendance. So if you want to go to the library, go through the museum, you can do so by going online and logging in at a certain time. As I said, they're limiting the number of people who are going because they want some spacing there. There aren't any tours going on right now, which is something that I do with my colleagues. But you can do a self-guided tour, which is the way most people do. But today we're going to be discussing, as you know, the space race, and so hopefully, again, welcome. We have about an hour together, as Robert said. Presentation should be about 45, 50 minutes. And that gives us 15 to 20 minutes to answer any questions that you might have. So make sure you put them into the chat. First, let me give you a little background on the library itself. There are 14 presidential libraries in the system. Number 14 is President Obama's, which is now being built on the south side of Chicago. Now, each of the libraries exists courtesy of what we call a public-private partnership. So all the libraries are built with private funds. No government money goes into building any of the libraries. I think back when they were raising money for the Kennedy Library, I think they raised about $20 million. I think the cost of the library is only about 12.5 million. The balance of the money, in case anybody's wondering, some of you who are in the area know about the Kennedy Center at Harvard, the government center at Harvard, and so it was donated to Harvard. And so you now have the Kennedy Center there. Once the library is built, they turn it over, the operations turned over to the National Archives and Record Administration, or NARA. And so they manage all of that. If you're wondering, and you've paid attention to the news lately, NARA, the National Archives, yes, that's the same NARA that's been in a little bit of a tussle with ex-President Trump over his papers. All of the presidential papers and so on supposed to be turned over to the Presidential Library upon somebody leaving office. Now, the location of the library was actually selected. The original site was selected by JFK himself. Actually, it was only a month before he was assassinated. He was at the Harvard campus, and he picked a spot near Harvard along the Charles River. After his death, Mrs. Kennedy interviewed a lot of well-known architects about building the library. You can imagine it would be a very prestigious assignment for any designer. And many of the famous architects of the day expressed interest. But she ended up picking someone who was relatively young, excuse me, and somewhat unknown at the time. He was the name of I.M. Pei. And I.M. Pei, I.M. Pei was actually born only 1 month before JFK. So he was born in April of 1917. JFK was in May of 1917. But I.M. Pei was a choice from Mrs. Kennedy, who obviously has some great instincts. So some of you may recognize his name, but I.M. Pei went on to design some of the most iconic buildings in the world. And locally, he actually did the John Hancock Tower in Boston. Out in Cleveland, he did the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But probably his most iconic building throughout the world is that he was the one who designed the pyramid entrance to the Louvre at the 200th anniversary of the Louvre in Paris. Anyway, IMP proceeded to design a building for the Harvard location. Unfortunately, the original site became unsuitable. Now think about it, it was in Cambridge. Cambridge is, as those of us who are from the area know, is fairly congested as it is. It contains not only Harvard, but MIT as well. And so they were looking for another site. And fortunately, UMass Boston came up and donated 9.5 acres of a place called Columbia Point. I believe Columbia Point itself is about 280 acres. And they came through with 9.5 acres right on the water. And Mrs. Kennedy thought it was really appropriate considering her husband's love of the sea. And so she loved the fact that it was right there overlooking the entrance to Boston Harbor. So IMP had to rip up his plans and to scrap his original plans and start from scratch again. And finally, 16 years after his death, in October of 1979, the library opened to the public. Now, so the library consists primarily of two sections. One is the museum that most of the public is able to see and tour. But the library itself, not the museum, the library itself contains about 26 million documents or papers of documents. And scholars, historians, and writers use the library for research. Something that most people do not know is that the library is also the repository for all of Ernest Hemingway's papers. Mrs. Hemingway donated those to the library some years ago. I don't have time to get into the reasons why now, but they also hold all of the papers for not only the entire Kennedy administration and so on, but also the papers for Ernest Hemingway. Now, JFK began his presidency in January 1961, which was right in the middle of the Cold War. As many of you know, this was a war of ideologies, how countries should be governed. It was basically democracy versus communism, capitalism versus socialism, and the two largest at the time proponents were of each side were the United States versus the Soviet Union. And this battle was fought on many fronts. And one such front was over space and space superiority. So today we're going to review America's early space program and look at talk a little bit about a few of the astronauts. But I'd like to begin just with a very brief history of rocketry. Now, Robert Goddard was considered to be, by many, to be the father of modern rocketry. He was born in Worcester, Massachusetts. For those of you outside of the state, Worcester is the second largest city in Massachusetts, and it's in the center of the state. And he attended Worcester Polytech, WPI, and then he went on to Clark University, also in Worcester, to get his doctorate. And in 1926, Robert Goddard, and I believe it was on a farm owned by his aunt, he conducted the first successful launch of a liquid fuel rocket. Simultaneously, in the 30s, Germany was developing its own missile program. And they were in communication with Goddard, sending ideas back and forth, and looked to Goddard for some suggestions. And in 1932, Germany brought on board Wernher von Braun, a young engineering prodigy who was interested in space exploration. Now, von Braun was really interested in space travel. He wanted to go to the moon. He wanted the ideas of going to the other planets. He really didn't see any military use for rockets. However, the German military felt otherwise. And by 1942, Germany had developed the V2 rocket, which was the first artificial object sent into space. Now, earlier in the war, in 1940 or 41, some of you history buffs may recall that there was something called the Blitz over London. that German warplanes, bombers were dropping. They went something like 56, 57 straight days of dropping bombs in London. And that was called the Blitz. Well, in 41, Hitler decided that he was interested in going after the Russians. So he took all of his bombers and he moved them to the Eastern Front. So the Blitz stopped. But a few years later, in 1944 and 45, there was another Blitz. And at that time, Germany used the V2 rocket. Now, during World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies, but it was pretty obvious towards the end of the war, and certainly it happened after the war, that the United States and the Soviet Union became adversaries. Of course, the Soviet Union was developing its own rocket program. And following the war, there was a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union to attract German rocketeers. The United States called their program Operation Paperclip. And the United States, through Operation Paperclip, was successful in convincing von Braun to come to America. And he brought 127 rocketeers with him. As an aside, and this surprised me, in my reading, I found out that all told, between 1945 and 1959, there were 1,600 German scientists who emigrated to the United States. Just an aside. Anyway, with his fellow rocketeers that he brought with him, von Braun and his team, they went to work for the Army Ballistic Missile Program, developing rockets for American satellites. But as I mentioned, the Soviets were working on their own missile program, and they beat America into space. And in October of 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial object to orbit the Earth. In fact, 1 month later, they launched their second Sputnik, Sputnik 2, in November of 1957. And that was pretty unique, not only because it was the second flight, but it was carrying a living organism. There was a stray dog, Laika. So Laika, which is a stray dog, was the first living creature to go into space. Meanwhile, the United States was having all kinds of problems with its rockets. They were blowing up on the launch pad. This is a picture of the Vanguard rocket blowing up. Of the first 11 tests that the United States attempted, 8 of them blew up. 8 of them were failures. Okay. But unlike the Soviet Union, America was televising. I mean, we didn't find out, we found out about Sputnik, but we didn't know how many failures they had had before that. But the United States was televising everything. So there was a lot of pressure on America at that point. Finally, in January of 1958, America launched its first satellite, Explorer 1. And then 6 months later, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, was formed under President Eisenhower. And 7 months after that, the original 7 Mercury astronauts were introduced. I always love this picture because it's their introductory press conference. And one of the reporters threw out the question, which of you is going to be the first into space? And of course, as you can see from this picture, they all raised their hands. Except for Wally Schirra right here and John Glenn. They both raised both of their arms. A very competitive group. They obviously were very accomplished. You had to be, number one, have an engineering degree, and number two, you had to have been a test pilot to apply to become an astronaut. So all of these guys were test pilots, all probably type A personalities, all very competitive. In 1960, the Army missile program under von Braun was merged under NASA. And it remained under NASA's leadership, under von Braun's leadership. You can see a picture of von Braun here with then President Eisenhower. Now, earlier, I mentioned, so it was taken out of the military. It was moved over to a civilian oversight, which was NASA. Now, earlier I mentioned that the Cold War the worldwide competition between democracy and communism. And of course, the Cold War dominated world affairs, world politics, geography, economics, trade, military, etc. And it played a significant role in domestic politics in the United States, more specifically, including the 1960 presidential election. Now, the space race itself was not an issue, but because the Soviet Union was ahead in the race for space, everyone assumed that they also were ahead in building rockets. And of course, I can recall at the time, people were worried about it because they've got the bigger rocks. Can they put bombs in space and bombs in orbit? Will they be able to drop them on us and so on? So there was a lot of fear going on. Later years, it was discovered that the Soviets were really were not ahead of the United States. In fact, the United States was actually leading the Soviet Union. However, at that time, no one knew that. And John Kennedy took political advantage of that perception, and he argued that a missile gap had developed and that the Soviet Union was far ahead. In fact, John Kennedy took office in January of '61, but shortly after he took office, the gap seemed to widen even more, because in April of 1961, the Soviet Union sent the first man into space. Yuri Gagarin made one orbit before returning to Earth. Now, the first American in space went up 1 month later, in May of 1961. America sent its first man into space, but he didn't orbit the Earth. This is what they called a sub-orbital flight. This is an old diagram we found in the archives from that time, and you can see that the rocket left Cape Canaveral and reached an altitude of about 116 miles, and then just came right back to Earth about 300 miles downrange. The entire flight only lasted 15 minutes. Now, the astronaut was a man by the name of Alan Shepard, and some of you from this area familiar with that he was from Derry, New Hampshire. I'll talk a bit more about Shepard and the flight shortly, but I first want to take a look at the vehicle or the capsule that Shepard rode into space. So the Mercury capsule was not very big, about 6 feet wide and 9.5 feet high. Astronauts could not be taller than 5 feet 11, nor weigh more than 180 pounds. Now, weight was a major concern because every additional pound meant that the rocket had to be that much bigger. So there was a continual effort by the capsule engineers and designers to keep the total weight down. I remember some of us talking a number of years ago as to why did they come to the logical conclusion they should have used women for the first astronauts, because on average, women are smaller and lighter than men. Well, the reality was that at that time, no women were, there weren't any female test pilots. So remember, one of the original criteria was that they had to have been a test pilot. Now, this is a picture of Shepard's launch atop with a Redstone rocket. And notice up here, here's the capsule right up here. And above that, you'll see this escape tower. And that was in case there was a problem during the initial parts of launch, the escape tower would pull the capsule away. And obviously as a safety precaution for the astronaut. Now, during that time, I guess you can see Robert, but hopefully you can see my little clip up there as well. There was something that happened to Alan Shepard that I always enjoy telling the story. Well, Alan Shepard climbed aboard the rocket, and there was delay after delay after delay where they sat up there. And he actually ended up sitting in that capsule for 4 hours before the flight. And so you can imagine, just use your imagination, what's going to happen after 4 hours. And if you think of almost basic functions, you're right. Alan Shepard had to urinate, but they had a dilemma. He's up on this rocket, and in order to, they would have to open up, bring that gantry back, which is a big red tower, bring it back, open up the capsule, take him out of the capsule, bring him down the elevator, take off his suit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this was obviously very problematic. So after discussing for a while, eventually they turned off, I hope they turned off the electrical system to his, that would be monitoring his physical situation, his heart rate and so on. And they said, Alan, go ahead and pee in your spacesuit. And so that's what he did. Literally, he had to pee in a spacesuit before he took off. He tells about that in his biography. Now, the flight itself was very successful. There were some limited objectives that were met. Now, obviously, in a 15-minute flight, there's not much you can do. But one of the things they wanted to find out is whether man could function in space. Would he be able to maneuver the spacecraft? That was what they were interested in. Some of you may have heard the terms, could he pitch, yaw, and roll? And what that meant is, could he maneuver the spacecraft left and right, up and down, and could he roll it? Could he turn it? And the reason for that is they were already anticipating that the astronauts would have to use those functions and be able to perform those maneuvers when they went to the moon. So they were already thinking ahead. Okay, so they tested pitch, yaw, and roll, and indeed he was able to do that. There's a picture of Alan Shepard being hoisted into the recovery helicopter after the spacecraft landed. You can see the spacecraft here in the water. Now, Alan Shepard was the only one of the 7 original astronauts. He actually walked on the moon. There's a picture of him, of President Kennedy pinning a medal on him after his flight. But Alan Shepard went to was the only one of the 7 original astronauts who went to the moon on Apollo 14. And all of these guys were characters as well as being competitive. And Alan Shepard actually snuck 3 golf balls in the capsule on his way up to the moon. And he had an engineer fashion a golf club at the end of one of the probes. So when Alan Shepard was on the moon, he literally dropped a couple of golf balls down, I think 3 of them, and whacked a few golf balls around. So those balls are still up there on the moon. Well, a few weeks, actually on May 25th, 1961, a few weeks after Alan Shepard's flight, President Kennedy went before Congress. And
I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
so that was if you think about it, I mean, here's Alan Shepard, just went up and just doing one of those suborbital flights. And this is 1961, and President Kennedy is committing the country within 8 years, by the end of 1969, to go to the moon and come back. So he said at the time, further in the speech, it would be a great new American adventure. It would be a great American enterprise. It would be impressive. It would be the key to our future on Earth. So JFK gave voice to all of these lofty goals. But behind the scenes, President Kennedy's primary objective was to beat the Soviet Union. And we've got recordings of him behind the scenes actually arguing and discussing this with James Webb, the head of NASA. And basically JFK said, you know, the space exploration is nice, the science is all nice and so on, but and basically he was saying, I don't give a damn. I want to beat the Soviets. So what can we do to beat the Soviets? And so he was asking Congress in this speech he was asking Congress and the country to get behind that effort. And at its height, the space program employed 400,000 people nationwide during this time period in the early 60s. And at one point, it consumed 4.5% of the entire federal budget. I mean, that's, if you think about it, that kind of blows my mind when you think about that much of a commitment to do that. But back to the space race itself, in that in July of 1961, 2 months after Shepard's flight, Gus Grissom, who was like Shepard, Alan Shepard, a test pilot, also had a second orbital flight. The flight was successful, but it didn't end very smoothly. What happened was, after he landed in the ocean, the outside hatch on Grissom's capsule blew open and water started pouring in. He was rescued. He got out of the capsule and they hoisted him up, but the capsule sunk. And believe it or not, 38 years later, they pulled it up in July of 1999. They were able to recover that capsule. It was still obviously down there. Now, at this point, the Soviet Union had put one man in orbit, and the United States had flown 2 suborbital missions. So they were obviously a bit ahead of us. However, the Soviets appeared to widen its lead even more when it launched, and people have forgotten about this. They launched a second cosmonaut into space. In August of 1961, Herman Titov made 17 orbits of the Earth. And all we still had to show for it was 2 suborbital flights. So you can imagine there was a lot of pressure on NASA at that point. But finally, in February of 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth, making 3 orbits. Now, during the suborbital flights, Shepard and Grissom had reached a speed of about 5,000 miles an hour. However, Glenn's spacecraft needed to reach 17,000 miles an hour to go into orbit. So they needed a larger booster, and that's what's called the Atlas booster. But it had its own share of failures during training and during development, so the launch was not without risk. In fact, somebody asked Glenn before the launch how he felt, and he said, quote, "How would you feel sitting on top of a machine with 1 million parts, all made by the lowest government bidder?" So Glenn's flight had been scheduled 10 times previously, but all of them had been canceled due to mechanical problems or weather. And in fact, on 2 of those occasions, Glenn was actually in the capsule when the launch was scrubbed. Now, fortunately, the 11th scheduled launch went without a problem. However, during the first orbit, a potential problem arose. And that was, there was a signal light at mission control indicating that the heat shield, which is this right here, I think you can, hopefully you can see, I want to use this. This is the heat shield right here, came loose. Now, what's the function of the heat shield? Well, the capsule is going around the Earth, and obviously when it comes back to Earth, it's going to come in at fantastic speeds, creating a lot of friction. And objects typically will burn up. Okay, so the heat shield was all important to protect the capsule and the astronaut from burning up. So the heat shield would come in face first and would absorb all the heat. But there was a problem here. Was the heat shield really loose? They had no way of really knowing, or was it a faulty signal at mission control? They didn't know. So they called up to John Glenn and they said to him, well, when you begin coming back to Earth, we recommend that you not jettison your retro pack. Now, the retro pack is this thing right here. Now, what's the retro pack for? Well, let's think about orbiting. He's orbiting at 17,000 miles an hour. And as long as he maintains that speed, he's going to continue to orbit. So in order for him to come back to Earth, they have to slow the capsule down so that gravity can take over and bring it back to Earth. And the way they slow the capsule down was firing 3 little rockets. You've got 3 rockets on this retro pack. So they would blast those off, slow the capsule down, gravity would take over. But normally, once that retro fire happened, they would jettison this. Now, it was held on by 3 little straps. You can see a strap here, there's a strap here, there's another strap here that's hidden. They would jettison the retro pack so that you had a clean face on the heat shield. But at this time, they said to him, John, we don't want you to jettison the retro pack. At first, when he asked them, what's that for? They said, not to worry about it at this point. But ultimately, they had to tell him the reason why. And, but there was, and obviously he came back, he was safe, but there was some very nerve-wracking moments because during reentry, there's a communications blackout of about 4.5 minutes because ionization around the capsule builds up. And at that time, the batteries on the capsule were not strong enough to force the communication signal through there. So they were literally deaf, dumb, and blind for 4.5 minutes as the capsule was hurtling through the atmosphere. Okay, was Glenn safe or had the capsule burned up in the atmosphere? In the meantime, John Glenn, who had a window in the capsule, began to see burning debris flying by. The retro pack was burning up and chunks were breaking away. He later said it was spectacular, a real fireball. But he also said that at the time, he wasn't sure if the debris was from the retro pack or from pieces of the heat shield. So you can imagine it was very tense for a lot of people. Now, John Glenn obviously became a national hero and went on to serve the nation. He served as a senator from Ohio from 1975 to 1979. And in 1998, at the age of 77, he flew on a space shuttle mission, testing the effects of space flight on aging. And then in 2012, John Glenn was awarded the President's Medal of Freedom that you can see President Obama bestowing upon him. Now, while all this is going on, remember I mentioned that the space program became a national effort to which thousands of people were working. Among them, excuse me, was a group of mathematicians, engineers, and scientists who performed calculations for the space missions. They were often called human computers. Now, most of these were women who had been hired to replace the men who had gone off to fight during World War II. When the men went off to fight, they brought these women into work behind the scenes on rocketry and so on and so forth. Now, many of these women were African Americans. Now, this was during the era of Jim Crow, when segregation laws were still in place throughout the South, where this work was being done. Now, some of you may have seen the movie Hidden Figures, and it was about these women and what these women had accomplished and contributed to the space program. But it was also about the problems and indignities that these women faced while working for NASA. One of the most well-known of these women was Katherine Johnson, who was a mathematician. Now, Katherine Johnson was born in 1918 in West Virginia, but the county where she grew up, in Greenbrier County, did not provide schooling for Black students beyond the 8th grade. So her family moved near West Virginia State College, an all-Black school, and Katherine graduated from high school at age 14 and then from college at age 18. And she went on to be hired by the government to work on aeronautics. And in 1958, this agency was disbanded and superseded by NASA. So Katherine became employed by NASA to work on trajectories and orbits. And she actually calculated the trajectory for Alan Shepard's flight, for Gus Grissom's flight, and she calculated the trajectory and the orbit for John Glenn's flight. In fact, just prior to flight, Glenn asked if the girl had checked the trajectory. Now, at that time, computers had not been fully developed. They were developing the computers. In fact, Katherine Johnson was one of the ones working with the tech people to develop computers that could take over all of this high mathematical work. But so just prior to his flight, John Glenn asked if, quote unquote, the girl had checked the trajectory. And Katherine confirmed that her calculations aligned with the new automated computers. And Glenn famously said, Well, if she says they're good, then I'm ready to go. Now, Catherine was with NASA for 33 years, and she worked on all the space programs, including the moon landing and the space shuttle. And then in 2015, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Obama, and she died in 2020. Bless her, at the age of 101. Following the Mercury program was Gemini. And the Gemini capsule had the same basic shape, as you can see, as the Mercury capsule, but it was a two-man vehicle. Okay, you can see a picture of it here. And in 1965, during one of those Gemini flights, Ed White became the first American to walk in space. He was actually outside the capsule for about 20 minutes. In fact, he was having so much fun, they had to convince him to come back inside. He said he didn't want to bother coming back in the capsule. He was having a heck of a time. So that was a two-man capsule. Then following that, of course, we went to the Apollo program from 1968 to 1972. And this was, of course, a three-man capsule. And you can see here, let me get my little pointer out again so you can see a little. Here is the command, what we call the command module. And in here was where the three astronauts were located. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Behind it was what they call the service module. And the service module provided propulsion right here, but it also provided electrical power and it stored fuel and oxygen. Now, we all focus on the landing on the moon, but I think one of the most significant flights in the Apollo program was actually Apollo 8, which was launched in December of 1968, because this is the first time that man had escaped Earth's gravitational pull. So Apollo 8 left Earth's gravitational pull and orbited around the moon. It's the first time, again, that man had ever escaped the Earth's atmosphere. So it went around the moon a total of 10 times. It was a week-long mission. So not only was it the first time that man had escaped Earth's gravitational pull, it's the first time that man had ever orbited around another celestial body. So the crew orbited the moon. During those 10 orbits, it snapped images of the lunar surface for potential landing sites for the moon mission. And one of the most iconic pictures they took was taken on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1968. It was entitled Earthrise. So as the space program proceeded, capsules and payloads became heavier. You went from the two-man Mercury to the one-man Mercury to two-man Gemini to Apollo. In addition to Apollo, now they've got to have all the equipment on there for the moon landing and so on. So plus they needed more speed to escape Earth's gravity. So as you can imagine, the rockets had to be more powerful. The boosters had to be more powerful. So they were much more weight, much greater distances, much more speed. And I thought this graphic was kind of interesting to show you the relative size of the rockets, starting with over here on the left. This is that original V2 rocket that I showed you that the Germans had produced. This is the Redstone rocket that Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom had flown on those suborbital flights. This is the rocket that John Glenn had flown to first circle the Earth, all the way up. Now, this is the rocket that Apollo, that said they went to the moon with. And I can tell you, I was down in Cape Canaveral some years ago and took a tour of the complex. And this rocket right here is over a football field in length, 360 feet tall. And to walk near, they had it on its side. They didn't have it up. They had it on its side. And you just cannot imagine the size of it. How it ever gets off the ground, I will never know. Okay, because once, not only was to get, it mentioned that John Glenn needed 17,000 miles an hour to go into orbit. They actually needed 18,000 miles an hour to escape Earth's gravity. So add the weight, the speed, the distance, et cetera, et cetera. So finally, in June 16, 1969, Apollo 11 took off. 6 months after Apollo 8, Apollo 11 was launched. with 3 astronauts whose names have become very familiar, although you probably forget Michael Collins, because he was the lone man up in the orbit, in the command module. But you have, of course, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. And then and on July 20th, 1969, Armstrong and Aldrin landed on the moon. And of course, it was the first time that man had walked on a celestial body other than the Earth. And then 4 days later, on July 24th, Apollo 11 splashed down in the Pacific, and thus completing by about 5 or 6 months the goal that John Kennedy had set some 8 years earlier, to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth. Now, since then, obviously, since that first moon landing, man's become more comfortable going to space, and space flight has become somewhat commonplace. So we see the space shuttle here, and we've discovered that man can work in space for prolonged periods of time. Not only men, but women can work in space for prolonged periods of time. This is the International Space Station. And in fact, it's now become an a place for international cooperation. When we think about those early years of competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, and to think how much of a battle that was, you think how far we've come since that very first time when John Kennedy and Werner von Braun looked towards the heavens. We have come a long way. So, time for questions. Before I do that, if any of you are interested, I just wanted to flash this up on the screen. If anybody is interested in doing some reading on your own, I wanted to flash this on the screen. The Right Stuff was written many years ago by Tom Wolfe. It kind of goes through the entire, primarily the Mercury program. A movie was made about it, but it was a terrific read. More recently, Douglas Brinkley wrote a book called American Moonshot that focuses primarily on the space race during the Kennedy era. A terrific book. And then the third one, I mentioned the movie Hidden Figures, but Margot Lee Shuttley wrote a book called Hidden Figures on those women, particularly the Black women who served behind the scenes in helping America get launched into space. So, Robert, I don't know if there's a way that we can enlarge my picture here.
Yep, so on our screen, you are enlarged.
Okay, fine. Okay, thank you.
So we can see you. And
right.
So Mike says that Alan Shepard is often attributed to saying something like, "I was not scared until I realized that every nut and bolt was provided by the lowest bidder."
Well,
So
that was comparable to what John Glenn had said. I mentioned earlier when they asked John Glenn how you felt, and he said that how would you feel sitting on top of a machine that has over 1 million pieces, all of which were built by the lowest bidder. So
there you go.
Yeah.
Rosamond says, "Fascinating talk. Thank you." She's so glad that you included mention of the Hidden Figures. And, a matter of fact, Rosamond, we actually have a talk on those folks coming up. Let me see if I can find it quickly. Yes.
I want to tell you a little story about that.
Go ahead.
It's funny. This Katherine Johnson that I mentioned, I assume that a lot of you have seen the movie Hidden Figures. And you might want to remember one of the scenes in there where Karen Johnson had to use the ladies' room, and she wouldn't, they wouldn't let her use it in the building, so she had to run outside the building and go to another building. Well, Katherine Johnson said that never really happened. Oh. And I like the real story even better. She said at the time that she had to use the restroom, she went and used the ladies' restroom right in the building, and she dared anyone to stop her. So that's in the book. So they took a little liberty when they made the movie, but I like the real story better.
So we're hosting a NASA Solar System Ambassador on Thursday, April 21st at 11 o'clock. And she'll be specifically talking about the Hidden Figures, Women of NASA. And so information about that program will be in the email that I send folks tomorrow. Mike acknowledged that yeah, he had written about Alan before you had mentioned Gled 7.
Right.
So
Okay.
so does anyone else have any questions or comments for Rick here? We have a question. Will the U.S. make it back to the moon and beyond? What are your thoughts?
Well,
there?
they're already planning to go to the moon.
Yeah.
I think they have long-term plans to go to Mars.
Right.
I'm not sure if it'll be in my lifetime, but they are right now. They are on work to go back to the moon with, I think, by 2024. Although that I may be wrong on that date. So maybe somebody else on the call can correct me on that if I'm wrong. But I think it's 2024. They're planning on going back to the moon.
And Rick, at one point you had said that back in the 1960s we were spending 4.5% of the national budget.
Yeah, that was incredible. That was in that book that I just talked about, American Moonshot. That was quoted by Douglas Brinkley. Yeah.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. I wonder what we're spending on NASA now. I'm sure it's
it's about 1/3 of 1%.
1/3 of 1%.
Yeah, 2 years ago we had or 3 years ago was the 50th anniversary of the Apollo landing, and we had a 2-day conference at the Kennedy Library, and they brought in Michael Collins, who died last year.
Yep.
Showed up there, and he was there as well in 2019. But they were talking about how much the budget had been cut. So I think it was like 1/3 of 1% now of the entire budget.
So Bernard says, great talk, very informative. Barbara wants to know, who was the first woman in space?
She's actually, I would think her name was Turishcheva. She was a Russian woman. I can't remember her exact name, but I think it was Turishcheva, but she was a Russian.
Patricia says, very interesting, thank you. Karen says, thank you for an enjoyable and informative session. So last call for questions. Anyone else have any questions or comments? Rick, is the official JFK Presidential Library Museum affiliated with whatever's on Hyannis for JFK? Is there some sort of museum?
No, they're separate altogether. That's a private museum.
Okay.
The Presidential Library in Boston is part of the entire presidential system, library system throughout the country, going back to Herbert Hoover. So everybody since Herbert Hoover has had a presidential library.
Sure. Gotcha. All right. Well, I don't see any further. Oh, wait a second. Gene says, thank you very much. Very informative. In July 1969, I was living in Germany and had to get up in the middle of the night to see the walk on television.
That I remember that. That was some time, because people, I mean, that was one time I could think of, in at least my lifetime, where people around the world really kind of united and was focused on one thing. Because even though it was America, I mean, think about the first time humankind had left Earth and landed on another celestial body. That was just something else that we all kind of rallied around together. Unfortunately.
Another question: when JFK was alive, was the plan to put the center in Cambridge before LBJ moved it to Houston?
I do not know. You mean, are you talking about I assume he's talking about the Space Center, the Houston.
I would think so, right?
Yeah, I have not read that, so I could not answer that question. But again, thinking back on the congestion in Cambridge, I would find that they would, because the area they need for that, the Johnson Space Center down there is huge. So I don't know where they would have the land, but again, I don't know for certain, so I couldn't say.
Comment, she saw Alan Shepard's launch televised in elementary school.
Okay.
It was unbelievable at the time.
Sure. Absolutely.
Those are the things you never forget, Rick. The things from your childhood or even your adulthood when you see these phenomenal, space adventures. It's something else.
Yeah,
they stand out.
It's funny though, because you saw the picture at the time of Neil Armstrong and Aldrin on the moon, and at the time they looked great, but now you look at them, it seems so ancient. They seem so old when you look at it.
All right. Final question goes to Pat. Where was mission control for the early flights?
Well, for the very early flights, mission control was right there at Cape Canaveral. I don't know when they moved it to Houston. Okay, but for the very early flights, Alan Shepard and and Grissom and so on. And I don't think they do a tour of it anymore, but I remember taking a tour of the early Mercury program down at Cape Canaveral. Yeah, you know, they changed the name after Kennedy passed away. They changed the name to Cape Kennedy.
Oh.
And it was that way for a while. I can't remember the date it changed back, but eventually the pressure was such that they changed it back to Cape Canaveral, but they call it the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral. That's how it's. For a while there, they called it Cape Kennedy.
All right. Every time I think we're done, someone asks another question.
Good.
But I think we've exhausted all the questions and comments. Rick, do you have any last words for the audience before we wrap up?
No, I appreciate everybody attending. I appreciate the questions, the comments. Would love to see you at the library now that they're open. You can check when the tours will begin. We enjoy doing those tours, but we may not be doing personal guided tours for a few months yet until we see what this new pandemic does. I want to apologize to everybody for my voice. I know it sounds very raspy. I am getting over COVID myself, so I apologize for my voice, but I hope everybody could understand.
I think they all understood you, Rick.
Okay.
You were great. So want to thank Rick so much. Want to thank everyone in the audience. Want to thank the 12 partnering libraries. Look for an email tomorrow with the feedback survey, with the recording, and with information about some other upcoming presidential library talks. And Rick was telling me before we started that the JFK Library offers a couple more webinars that maybe we'll take advantage of in the future. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Bye, Rick.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.